Afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us here today. I'm Susan Mims, the CEO for Dogwood Health Trust. And as we strive to create a region where every generation can live, learn, earn, and thrive, no exceptions, we know that the first step is to gain a much deeper knowledge about the gaps and opportunities that exist in our region. And that's why Dogwood Health Trust has already commissioned extensive studies around housing, early childhood education, and now K-12 education. We are very pleased to share what we learn with you in the community. You can go to our website for the studies that we've done so far and download them for free, and please share them and use them in the work that you do every day, which is so essential as our partners in Western North Carolina. I would now like to introduce Dr. Erica Williams, who serves in our community investment team as Vice President for Education. And she's going to share a little bit more about this study and introduce you to the scholars who helped us conduct this research so essential for Western North Carolina. Erica?
Thank you, Dr. Mims, and many thanks to all of you joining us today. As you may know, we enlisted the research and analysis expertise of the Education and Policy Initiative at Carolina, or EPIC, as they are known. EPIC is a group of quantitative and qualitative scholars at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill who conduct rigorous and responsive education research and evaluation that informs practice and policy for the betterment of students, educators, schools, and communities. Dogwood commissioned a landscape analysis of K-12 education outcomes in Western North Carolina to help inform our future investments in K-12. This comprehensive landscape study highlights the strengths in our region's K-12 schools, in addition to the opportunities for Dogwood and our partners to better promote the well-being of students throughout Western North Carolina. The team at EPIC conducted this rigorous research by comparing data on the K-12 students, educators, and schools in Western North Carolina with those of other parts of the state. EPIC also explored how our region's students, teachers, and schools fared during the COVID pandemic. This study gives us data specific to our region and quantifies the opportunities we currently have to better promote the well-being of all students in Western North Carolina. It will serve as our guide as we amplify our work around K-12 education. We're excited to share this information with you today, and I have the absolute privilege of introducing the team from EPIC who conducted this research. Kevin Bastian holds a PhD in public policy from UNC Chapel Hill and serves as the Director of Research for EPIC. He is the Principal Investigator for the Educator Quality Research Initiative, a partnership between EPIC and the University of North Carolina System Office focused on improving educator preparation and the evaluation of the UNC System laboratory schools. In addition to these projects, Dr. Bastian leads a research partnership with the US Prep, a technical assistance center supporting improvement in university-based educator preparation program. His research interests include educator prep, labor markets, and the on-the-job learning, estimating teacher and principal effectiveness, the distribution of educational resources, and using data to inform the improvement of educator preparation programs. Sarah Crittenden Fuller holds a PhD in public policy from the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. She currently serves as principal investigator for the multi-year evaluation of the Gaining Early Awareness and Readiness for Undergraduate Programs, also known as GEAR Up, North Carolina Intervention. Dr. Fuller is also leading projects examining the impacts of natural disasters on educational outcomes nationwide and the impacts of remote learning due to COVID-19 on schools in North Carolina. Other areas of ongoing research for Dr. Fuller include high school reform models, the impacts of school nutrition on academic outcomes, and the influence of hurricanes in North Carolina on childhood outcomes. Her work leverages large administrative data sets and quasi-experimental designs to estimate the causal effects of policies and events on student outcomes. Camille Mickelson is a quantitative research assistant with EPIC. Her background includes working as a high school special education teacher, a middle school math teacher, and providing substitute teaching services for teachers at all levels and in all subjects. Her research and policy interests, influenced by her time in the classroom, include gender and racial equity in STEM fields, equitable and just access to special education services, school culture and staff culture, and the impacts of COVID-19 on the education system, as well as individual achievement. Camille holds a BA in Latin American Studies from Brigham Young University, an MED in Special Education from Arizona State, and an MPP with an emphasis in education policy from Portland State University. I'll now turn the program over to Drs. Bastian, Fuller, and Camille.
Thank you so much, Erica. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can share with everyone the PowerPoint slide deck we'll go through today. All right, so as Dr. Williams set up for us, this is a chance to provide sort of a landscape analysis of K-12 education outcomes in the western part of the state. And I'll do just a little bit more to talk about EPIC in this work, although Dr. Williams set that up well. So EPIC, we're a research group at UNC Chapel Hill. We're in the public policy department. We've been around for basically 15 years now. Again, we're a team of quantitative and qualitative scholars, and we're really aiming to conduct work. It's really, at the center of practice and policy as well, so that outcomes for students in schools and educators can be improved. And we have some really long-standing relationships with the State Department of Public Instruction, the UNC system, the state board, which is really central to our work. So why a landscape analysis? Well, again, we wanted to be able to provide Dogwood Health Trust and its community partners there in the western part of the state with evidence about what's going on with K-12 students and educators in schools. And of course, that would mean an opportunity to identify strengths in the region and opportunities for growth in the region. And at the end of the day, this is because of a shared commitment and belief in the value of data and evidence to really be able to inform decision-making, and in this case, helping inform DHT's engagement with partners in the western part of the state. So at a high level, I just want to give you sort of an overview of today's agenda. I'll start by giving just a little bit of a background on the data and the analyses we used and performed. I'll turn it over to my colleague Camille to share some data with you on the impact of the pandemic on K-12 students. That includes the DHT region, other parts of the state. From there, Sarah will talk to you about outcome for student subgroups in the DHT region. And lastly, I'll circle back to talk about some opportunities for students to learn and develop in the DHT region with a real emphasis on educators and what does the educator workforce look like in the western part of the state. And then from there, we'll have time certainly for a summary and questions and dialogue. So we used for this work that you'll see today, data for the State Department of Public Instruction. And we sort of have 3 time periods for our analysis. We have an early period, which is data from the 13-14 and 14-15 school years. A middle period, which is data from the 17-18 and 18-19 school years. And of course, those are the 2 last sort of full years before the COVID-19 pandemic. And then the most recent data we have is from the 2020-21 school year. We're just starting to get 21-22 data in from NCDPI. So the most recent data we're looking at for this work is 2021. So more particularly, what does that mean? On the student side, we have data on at the individual student level, demographics, and program participation, by which we might mean English learner, students with disabilities, academically and intellectually gifted, economically disadvantaged, etc. We have test scores on end of grade and end of course exams and the ACT. We have course grades, particularly for middle and high school students. Course taking, so our students taking AP courses or honors courses or dual enrollment courses. We have data on attendance, how many days is a student enrolled and present during a school year. We have disciplinary records to know whether a student was suspended during a school year. And then we have data on educational attainment. Did the student drop out? Did they graduate? Were they retained in grade? On the educator and school side, we have data on educator demographics. When I say educator, I mean, and when I say educator, I mean teachers, but I also mean school leaders, principals, APs. And for some data, that also includes counselors, social workers, school psychologists. We have data on the credentials of educators, by which I mean years of experience, how they were prepared, whether they're nationally board certified, etc. We have data on their employment, performance, and retention. So employment would be sort of where they're working and what roles they're working in as an assistant principal, as a teacher. Performance data includes evaluation ratings on the state's evaluation system, and also teacher EVOS estimates. And retention would be, are they staying in the state's public schools or in the same district or in the same school? And we also have a set of data about characteristics of schools and characteristics of districts. So in this work, we're going to make some comparisons, as Dr. Williams was foreshadowing. We'll make some geographic comparisons, some time comparisons, and sort of some subgroup comparisons. So there's 19 school districts in the DHT priority region in the western part of the state, and we'll compare outcomes and data in those 19 districts to other Western North Carolina districts, and that's 7 in total, and all other North Carolina districts who aren't in those first 2 groups, so 89 other districts across the state. We'll also make some time comparisons where we compare outcomes in an early or middle period to 13, 14, 14, 15, 17, 18, or 18, 19 to our most recent data in 2021. And then we'll cut the data and have some subgroup comparisons. We'll look at data by student characteristics, by school characteristics, and sometimes by DHT subregion, where Dogwood Health has a Western, Central, and Eastern sort of subregion within their main region. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Camille.
Thanks, Kevin. So I'm going to talk about the impact of the pandemic on the DHT region and how that compares to the other regions within the West and the whole state of North Carolina. There are some clear impacts of the pandemic across student achievement, engagement, and attainment outcomes that Kevin introduced. So let's look at some charts. We looked at proficiency rates for elementary EOGs. And when you look at this chart, you'll notice that all the math are the solid lines and all the reading scores are the dotted lines or dashed lines. DHT is the dark blue. All the other Western group is gray, and all the other LEAs in the state are the light blue. So when you look at this data, it's clear that whether the elementary proficiency rates were increasing or not before the pandemic did have a really substantial impact on elementary grades and how students are performing on these EOGs since then. you'll see a similar trend in middle grades. Interestingly enough, reading and math have switched places from elementary school, where students are generally doing better at testing and reading. And math seems to be a real struggle for students in middle school at this point. And then similar in high school as well. When we look at the next chart, there's math and science. The math 1 and the biology EOGs kind of follow a similar pattern. Reading, or the English 2 grades, EOCs don't seem to have tanked quite as much, but there's still an obvious difference from before the pandemic in the proficiency rates of these students. We also are going to look at absences, days absent, and chronic absences. Chronic absences we defined as 10% or more absences throughout the school year. So if you look at the left side of the screen, we have the scale for the days absent. Were they missing 2 days or 6 days? And then on the right side of the screen, we see the percent chronically absent. So we'll see that over time, there's been an increase of absences with a pretty stark upswing in the late period, which is the most recent data that we have after the pandemic. But also the percent of chronic absences has increased quite a bit. And that could mean that there are a similar number of students missing days, but missing more days. We'll look more into detail at who it is that's actually missing those days in our report and later in the presentation as well. And then similarly, grade retention and dropout are affected. And because grade retention is an indicator of future dropout numbers, we're particularly concerned about the increase of grade retention. But grade retention was dropping, and then post-pandemic. This is interesting, especially because when you look at data from 2020, whatever data that we do actually have, it was grade retention and dropout information was inconsistent because attendance was collected inconsistently. And so there's this overall trend of fewer students being retained in grade during 2020, but then it gets more dramatically increases afterwards, after the pandemic, when we were back in person more often and we were more consistent about the way we were reporting attendance and grade retention dropouts. And with that, I will turn it over to Sarah.
Thanks, Camille. So Camille presented a lot of averages across all students within the DHT region and how those have changed over time. I'm going to talk more about looking at specific student subgroups. One thing that kind of stands out as you compare the DHT region to the other districts in the western part of the state, as well as the rest of the state of North Carolina, is that on many outcomes, the DHT region is doing about as well as the state, or even a little bit better on average. However, there are some stark differences in outcomes between students and school subgroups within the region that are really in need of attention. In many cases, these patterns of gaps in outcomes follow those of the rest of the state and even across the nation. However, it would be a mistake to believe that because these gaps in outcomes exist in other places as well, that they are not important to address in the western part of the state. So looking at proficiency rates by race, ethnicity in the DHT region, this is elementary school proficiency. You see the same patterns, proficiency at other levels as well. If you look at white students in the DHT region, their performance is substantially higher than any group of students of color. In particular, Black students in the DHT region have proficiency rates that lag way behind those of white students in the region. We also see lower proficiency rates for Hispanic students, American Indian students, and multiracial students. when you look by program participation, and here I mean programs that exist in schools that provide services to students. So economically disadvantaged students are those who are eligible for free or reduced price lunch. Limited English proficiency students are those who are eligible to receive English language learner services. Students with disabilities are identified by having access to services intended to support them. And then academically and intellectually gifted students are identified for enrichment services. When you look at these, economically disadvantaged students fall somewhat below the average for DHT as a whole. However, that gap size is actually a bit smaller than you see across the state, which is some good news and a bright spot. However, when you look at students who are eligible for English language services and students with disabilities, proficiency rates are quite low. The elementary school rates are actually higher than proficiency rates in middle or high school for these groups. But overall, I think we simply can't be satisfied with 15% of students who need English language services passing a standardized exam. We can't be satisfied with 15% of students with disabilities passing those same exams. We do see academically and intellectually gifted students, indeed, as one might expect, do perform very well. And then when we look by school characteristics, so comparing schools that are lower poverty or higher poverty based on a scale set by schools across the state, what we see is that proficiency rates are quite a bit higher within schools with lower poverty within the DHT region. This is a common pattern, but something that is of concern and suggests that there is a need for more support in high poverty schools. So then turning to a non-test outcome, looking at course grades for middle and high school students, we see similar patterns by race ethnicity, where white students have higher GPAs than students of color. In particular, Black students and American Indian students have lower grades. And this is an important outcome, particularly when we're looking at graduate GPA, because grades may become an important point of access to post-secondary education, as well as a signal for how much students are getting out of their education in school. Then turning to program participation, again, we see a similar set of patterns where economically disadvantaged students fall somewhat lower than the average for all students, but the groups with the lowest grades are those who need supports for English language learning and students with disabilities. So once again, turning to high poverty versus low poverty schools, you can see that the grades are much lower in our high poverty schools in the Western region. Sometimes people sort of think of grades as being relative within a school. So, big fish in a small pond. But actually what we see is that grades are quite a bit lower in high poverty schools, which then may present a barrier to students who are seeking higher education. Now turning to absences, which can be considered, somewhat of a proxy for engagement, as well as something that just has a direct impact on students' ability to learn. It's difficult to learn the class materials if you simply aren't there. We see sort of a flip in the patterns here, where white students compared to students of color have lower absences and lower rates of chronic absenteeism. In particular, Black students stand out as missing on average 20 days of school in the 2020-21 school year. Now, absences in the 2020-21 school year were up very significantly compared to other school years. Nonetheless, it's a point of significant concern that more than a third of Black students and nearly 30% of multiracial American Indian and Hispanic students were missing 10% of their school days. That's a lot of school to miss. And so catching those students up is a challenge that the Western region is confronting. And then when you look by program participation, we see the highest rates of chronic absences and the most days absent among economically disadvantaged students, followed once again by those limited English proficiency students and students with disabilities. So these student groups that are struggling in school are also more likely to be absent. Then turning to school poverty, chronic days absent and chronic absent rates are much higher in high poverty schools. So this presents a real barrier to these students learning and gaining higher grades, greater proficiency if they're simply not in the school. So supports to engage students with school to bring them back into the classroom are a hurdle that can have big payoffs in the western part of the state as well as across the state. So then this is the percent of students who are ever suspended, at least one suspension during the school year. And this, we have this broken down by DHT region because we do see very substantial differences by race, ethnicity across the three regions, and feel that's important to highlight. Here we're looking at data from the 2017-18 and 18-19 school years, simply because the data from the 2020-21 school year suggests that students don't get suspended a whole lot when they are learning remotely. So it's sort of an outlier. We want to look at what kind of the general trends in discipline have been. And what stands out here is that the rate of suspensions for Black students are very high. These are high relative to their peers in the western part of the state. They're also high relative to Black students across the state, particularly in the central DHT region. This is a really big concern because we know that suspensions is associated with a lot of bad outcomes, such as disengaging and dropping out of school. In later life, it can be associated with challenges around employment, around crime. And so we don't want to be pushing these students out of school. Turning to educational attainment, so retention and grade, percent dropping out, and percent graduated. Actually, these are actually outcomes that don't vary as much as some others across some of the student subgroups, but when you consider differences across high poverty and low poverty schools within the DHT region, there are very large differences in retention and grade, percent dropping out, and especially percent graduated between high poverty and low poverty schools. So there's a real need for focus on getting students across that finish line in these high poverty schools so that they have high school diplomas and those credentials that can lead to higher paying jobs and opportunities to attend higher education. I'm now turning over to Kevin to talk about opportunities to learn.
Thanks, Sarah. And I'll just note that as we're going through this presentation, what you're seeing today is sort of a snippet, if you will, of all the data available. And as Dr. Williams was noting, the report that we've completed is on the DHT website, where you can find many, many more appendix tables and figures than what we sort of even have an opportunity to show you today. But lastly, I want to talk a little bit about sort of students' opportunities to learn. And again, a lot of this is going to focus on educators. And here, there's reason for both sort of optimism and concern regarding students' opportunities to learn and develop in the DHT region. So here, we're going to look at student advanced course taking. And we can see that the left figure is showing the percentage of students, really high school students to be clear, taking advanced placement or international baccalaureate courses. And relative to all other parts of the state, the DHT region and that of those other Western North Carolina districts are quite a bit lower there. But we actually see kind of conversely, and when you think about dual enrollment, so often dually enrolled in a high school and a community college or four-year institution, that DHT students and students in the western part of the state more generally are much more likely to be dual enrolled than their high school peers in the other 89 districts of the state. So here we're going to consider teacher and principal demographics, particularly whether teachers and principals are a person of color. And this matters given a lot of research showing that educators of color, teachers of color, promote really desired outcomes for students of color, but also white students as well. So the red line you'll see on your screen is the percent of students of color in the DHT region. And you can see that it is modestly increased, over our period from around, 23%, 24%, back in 2013, 14, and 14, 15 to, 28% or so today. What should also be clear is that there have been no commensurate increases in the sort of percent teachers of color or administrators of color in the DHT region. So if you were to look at the solid blue line or the hashed blue line, you can see throughout this period, the percent teachers of color in the DHT region, the percent principals of color in the DHT region are really remaining the same, flat, about 4%. Next, we'll consider teacher preparation. So really, we've broken teacher preparation here down into 3 broad categories. Whether someone was prepared to teach at an in-state public or private institution, traditionally prepared, whether they were prepared at an out-of-state institution, or whether they've entered teaching through an alternative or residency pathway. And we can see here that relative to those all other districts, the light blue, a much higher percentage of teachers in the DHT region were prepared in state. And sort of conversely, a much lower percentage of teachers in the DHT region have entered through an alternative or residency pathway. And this is important because on average, we find that in-state prepared teachers are more likely to stay in teaching in the state, and they're a little bit more effective than out-of-state prepared teachers or alternative entry or residency teachers. It's worth noting, though, that those who enter through a residency or alternative entry program are more likely to be a person of color, and that has some bearing, perhaps on the previous slide we saw on the demographics of the workforce. So this slide considers teacher credentials, by which we mean the percent of teachers who are novice, so have less than 3 years of teaching experience, the percent of teachers who are nationally board certified, the percent of teachers who have a graduate degree, and the licensure exam scores of teachers. And here you can see that the DHT region and Western North Carolina more broadly has fewer novice teachers, which matters because on average, early career teachers are somewhat less effective than their more experienced peers. The western part of the state, DHT region included, has a higher percentage of NBC teachers, nationally board certified teachers. And again, this matters because plenty of work suggests that NBC teachers are more effective than peers without that credential and are more likely to stay in teaching. There's no real difference in the percentage of teachers with a graduate degree, but we do see that teachers in the DHT region have slightly higher licensure exam scores on average than peers in other Western North Carolina districts, and certainly higher exam scores than teachers in all other parts of the state. So there's different ways we can consider teacher performance. 2 of the ways the state certainly does are evaluation ratings and EVOS estimates. So here on the left side, we're looking at average teacher evaluation ratings in the DHT region across other Western districts and all other districts in the state. And here you can see a pretty meaningful difference in evaluation ratings where the ratings are higher in the DHT region. We can't be sure that, of course, that signifies higher quality instruction in the DHT region of teachers. It could be that there's differences in rating practices across the state. On the right-hand side of the screen, we see teachers' EVOS estimates. And in this case, those are coming from the 18-19 school year, as that was the last year we had EVOS data pre-COVID. Excuse me. And here we see that in the DHT region, teachers there have slightly higher EVOS estimates than teachers in all other districts, but slightly lower than teachers in the other Western North Carolina districts. It's important to note that teacher credentials and teacher performance measures can certainly vary across schools with different percent students of color, different percent student poverty. Just like Sarah was showing earlier, the real differences by student and school subgroup and some student outcomes. There's similar stories for teacher outcomes. So for instance, within the DHT region, teachers in high poverty schools are earning lower evaluation ratings than teachers, their peers in low poverty schools. Teachers in high poverty schools have lower EVOS estimates than teachers in low poverty schools. Teachers in high poverty schools tend to be less well credentialed. They're less likely to have a national board certification. They're more likely to be a novice. They have lower exam scores, etc. So, these patterns are actually consistent statewide, not just in the DHT region, but again, are important to take note of. Here we're looking at teacher retention and what percent of teachers are returning to teach in the state's public schools, in the same district, or in the same school in the following year. And here we can see that retention rates in the DHT region are slightly kind of in the middle, right? Slightly lower than other Western North Carolina districts, but generally slightly above all other districts in the state. And again, similar to the previous slide, we also find in the DHT region and across the state, teachers in high poverty schools are less likely to return to that school in the following year than their peers in lower poverty schools. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about student support personnel, by which I mean counselors, social workers, and school psychologists. And what we're showing here is data on the number of full-time support personnel per 1,000 students. And you can see that in the most recent period, the number of full-time support personnel in the DHT region and in all other districts has upticked a little bit. And that could be ESSER funding and some sort of other federal data coming in through the pandemic. You can actually see there's been a pretty large and significant increase in the number of full-time support personnel in those other Western North Carolina districts. And actually unpacking this data a little bit more, we really find that there have been increases in the number of full-time counselors and school social workers, but the data on school psychologists is really, it's flat or slight decreases in their numbers over time. Lastly, we look at the the distribution of these support personnel to schools based on the poverty level of the school. We're looking within the DHT region here in the most recent year. And this is sort of the exception to the general rule we've seen in data and talked about earlier in this presentation. And that is high poverty schools in the DHT region actually have a more concentrated numbers of counselors, social workers, and school psychologists than low poverty schools in the DHT region. So these schools where students might need more support personnel might need more social work and counseling services are actually maybe getting that there in those schools. So in summary, we saw that student academic engagement and attainment outcomes have fallen in the DHT LEAs through the pandemic. This is not surprising. It mirrors other parts of the state. Although these decreases in outcomes are similar to other districts statewide, they clearly require action of schools and educators and policymakers to help students recover. As Sarah presented, there's key student subgroups in the DHT region, and they have lower outcomes than their peers. Groups in particular need of investment include students of color, English learners, English language learners, students with disabilities, and students in high poverty schools. Lastly, we see that teachers, school administrators, student support staff in the DHT region, they're generally well qualified and are performing pretty well, but school personnel in the DHT region are overwhelmingly white and are not reflecting the student demographics of the region and are not sort of keeping pace with commensurate changes in student demographics in the region. And so that completes our scheduled presentation. I think now I'll turn it back to the DHT team.
Thank you. Thank you, Drs. Fuller, Bastian, and Camille, for sharing a few of those highlights with us. I hope everyone found this information useful and will carry it back to create more conversation and ideas on how to best support our K-12 students and their families. Now we want to take as many questions as we can in the time we have left. Betsy Russell, our Senior Director of Communications, will share questions we've gathered from the chat. Betsy, what do you have for us, for the EPIC team, for us?
Just a few. If we could take the screen share down, that would be great. And one sort of little question, in those slides, there was LEAs and then there was other Western North Carolina LEAs. Can you guys define what those other Western North Carolina LEAs were?
I can pull up the report to name them all specifically, but they are 7 districts in the western part of the state that aren't part of the DHT region, and they're part of, I believe, if you look at the state board has 8 education regions in the state. I think there's 7 districts in region 7 that aren't part of the DHT priority region.
Okay, great. We had another question about whether or not you guys considered nursing support staff when you were looking at the information about school support service providers.
Wish we could. We don't really have we have better data from the state on psychologists, social workers, and counselors, and we don't really have good and consistent data on school nursing. So that's a definite need, and had we been able to, we definitely would have. Great.
Another person is asking, what determines low and high poverty schools? What's the benchmark for that?
Yep. So this is when Sarah was introducing it, she mentioned it was sort of relative statewide. And what we've done is we've taken what DPI reports for the percent low income students at a school. And we just taken all 2,500 schools across the state, essentially, for that measure, and we put them into quartiles. So the high poverty schools would be in the top quartile of the percentage of low income students. And the low poverty schools would be in the bottom quartile for that measure.
Great. And then another similar kind of question about how you define things. What characteristics determine a student with disabilities?
This is a state-defined category based on students who receive services through an individualized education plan.
Okay. Do you have any thoughts about the fact that sort of student performance took a downward turn during COVID, but the trajectory was already moving that way anyway? Do we know, like, COVID obviously exacerbated things, but did you guys get any data about causes beforehand?
So I don't have any perfect answers to that. I think, there are always lots of reasons why. There are general trends. One important thing to remember is that the demographics in North Carolina public schools have been changing over time. We have more students who are eligible for free or reduced price lunch and more students of color who are not always served well by our public schools. We have more English language learners. So those are some things that may result in sort of overall trends. Another piece is just sometimes what counts as proficient hasn't necessarily always been stable, completely stable over time. And so sometimes you just see small shifts in the percent proficient because they've changed the test updates. One thing that's very clear is that the change in outcomes during COVID is not an artifact of some kind of measurement or changes in the demographics of who's in the school. These are real meaningful changes in performance.
Great. And is the suspension data on, is it all suspensions? Is it or a subgroup like out of school suspensions? Does it include in school and out of school, or?
The in school or the suspension data is all out of school suspension.
Okay, and then I have a question about it. Can the statistics of the data be broken down by individual schools? Or is this just aggregate?
So the problem with reporting for individual schools is that then we have small enough numbers that it violates the FERPA policy. So it would sometimes provide or violate people's privacy, essentially.
We have
Yeah.
several questions in the, oh, I'm sorry, did I cut someone off?
I was going to say, there also, if you check out the school report cards on NCDPI's website, there's not exactly the same set of data, but there are a set of outcome data for each individual school within the state. And those are definitely worth looking at.
Great. Does the study, oh, here's obviously someone who is very into data. This is a good question. Was a multivariate analysis conducted to determine the factors or combinations of factors that indicated the greatest impact on success? So low income versus not, race, ethnicity, disability, attendance, teacher training.
Good question. No, we are only reporting sort of descriptive statistics here. These are sort of descriptive averages of like percent proficient, percent absent, unadjusting for any characteristics.
And another data question, is there any data or metrics that show the difference between students involved in after-school programming or not? We have a lot of data folks on this call today.
We do not have any, to my knowledge, sort of data on students after-school participation that we get from the state. That's not to suggest it might not exist at a school or district level, right? But we don't have any data centralized from DPI that would allow any sort of analyses there.
Great. And we are getting a lot of questions in the chat about recommendations. Do you guys have, based on your work and this research, any recommendations sort of programmatically that seem to work across the state, or any policy recommendations that you would suggest for advocacy organizations?
I mean, I will say, the thing that there are many different approaches to all of these problems. The thing that sticks out to me the most is that policies, programs that bring down the suspension rates for Black students in the central and eastern region are likely to have big payoffs.
And that
I would
might
also,
restorative justice practices. Sorry, go ahead, Kevin.
I was going to also highlight some of Sarah's work on the community eligibility provision and the provision of school meals, which, was starting to happen before the pandemic, and all meals were sort of free. It's not the case now again across the state. And I think that, there's certainly reason to be thinking. I think a lot of what we're all saying here is, between Sarah, Camille, and myself, as well as the real impact that nutrition and sort of health outcomes as well sort of have on kids and their academics. And that's not to sort of mention or to neglect mentioning efforts that we're actually partnering with NCDPI on. So, that's thinking about summer learning programs and how those can help students recover and accelerate learning.
Great. And do the LEAs that you looked at, does that data include the federally recognized tribe school system, the tribal school system?
Unfortunately, we don't have that data. It's not included in the data that NCDPI has because technically the Cherokee Central schools are not North Carolina public schools based on the domain that the law boundary falls into. I wish we had that data. I'd be happy to analyze it for somebody if it could be of help, because I do think that's an important gap when we think about what's going on with students in this region.
Right. And another question just then about data, did it include private schools in Western North Carolina?
It doesn't include private schools also for somewhat of the same reason. I mean, they're not required to be reporting data to NCDPI. Some of their students wouldn't be taking even some of the same tests, et cetera.
Great. Okay. I believe that questions have stopped. If anybody else wants, oh, there's another one. Someone is suggesting other ways to support students and performance, like summer learning opportunities, meals, recruiting teachers, things that reflect, and recruiting teachers that reflect the demographics of the community. That's their takeaway from some of this. Question about whether or not the data includes charter schools.
That's a little bit mixed. The answer is yes and no. Yes, from the student outcomes, the student data perspective, it largely does. To really much lesser to no extent on the educator side, largely because while charter school students take a lot of the same tests, the reporting for sort of educator data is different for charter schools.
All right. Are we able to track the trajectory of teachers from their North Carolina educational institutions to their subsequent performance as educators?
Short answer is yeah, definitely yes. Not honestly, part of what EPIC's done for a very long time now is working with the UNC system to think about the outcomes for UNC system prepared teachers as a whole, but also outcomes for particular institutions, whether that be UNC Asheville, Western Carolina, App State, NC State, etc.
Okay. And do you have data on homebound students and sort of what categories they fall into in terms of like disability, income, race?
My understanding is that homebound students should be classified as part of the students with disabilities category. And so if there's data on them, they would be part of that subgroup.
Great. Okay. Any other questions from our audience? Looking back through. I think that might be it. Erica, would you like to close us out? Talk a little bit.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'm sorry, was there one more, Betsy?
Oh, no, I was just saying, close us out, maybe speak a little bit about how Dogwood is going to use this data.
Absolutely. So first, just a reminder that it's been said a couple of times, but let us remind again that the full report is available there on Dogwood's site. I saw a comment or a question or two about next steps, and part of our next steps we shared with partners on October 6th includes making sure first that we had today that we shared these data publicly and widely with the community, and that we circle back as a team with the community to listen to now what. A lot of that work was done in those initial days of Dogwood. The team here that was assembled, listened, held listening sessions, one-on-one small groups, you name it. We'll be circling back to the community in a deep way at the beginning of 2023 to listen deeply again. And then together with the community in hand, we'll choose the path forward to address those opportunities that are presented to us here. In the meantime, I saw a couple of comments about after school and those pieces. For those that weren't with us on October 6th, we are looking forward in 2023 in education to the WNC After 3 effort. Right now, and the scholars can please stop me if I'm wrong, I'm not familiar with DPI collecting data systematically on what after school opportunities are there for our students in K-12 across the state. We do have partners that do that work on behalf of the state every day, and we'll be working with regional partners and state partners to really inventory what it is that we do and do well in that space after school. And we look forward to showing up to the community to address those areas deeply and widely in 2023. So we'll do a soft entry into some of these issues with WNC After 3. We'll come back and listen more in 2023 with these data in hand and hear community response, and we will build a path forward together. So on that note, I want to thank again. Yes, Susan.
Erica, can I come in for one moment? And
sure.
Really, I'm reacting to something in the chat. Someone put in the chat, I think the health outcome factors must be part of the consideration for educational outcomes. And I just wanted to pull up while we're focusing on education today. And for those who weren't at our community meeting and didn't get to hear, all of our strategic priority areas have a really great conversation about how they're integrated. So that includes housing as well as education, economic opportunity, and health and wellness. And so all of these things, you know, are intertwined, and we will be looking at the interconnection of these things, of these areas, because it's really hard to talk about any one of them in isolation. So that I just wanted to raise up that excellent point that was in the chat. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Well said. Is there something? Thought I heard someone else there. If not, we thank you all for joining us today. Please pull the report, look through it closely, get back to us. If you have a conversation you want to start with us, go to the Start a Conversation button there on the Dogwood site. We look forward to the engagement. Thank you for your time today.
Thanks, everyone.